So we're on the bottom. Got it. We're on the bottom of Chozayin Amabes. Last two words, I assume.
Yeah.
Okay, Amar Rabba. Though the Rosh is the gears Amar Rabba. Shama mixas tekiyos bubor mixas tekiyos asfasa boy yatsa. If a person heard part of the shofar blast while he was inside of the pit, and then heard the other part of the shofar blast, like the last half when he was on the border of the pit on the outside, yatsa, then he would fulfill his obligation. So the question is, does that mean that you only have to hear half of the shofar blast? Because we said that if you're standing, let's say, outside of the pit and the shofar blast is in the pit, so then if you presumably only heard an echo, a kol havara, so you wouldn't be yotze, but maybe because you heard half of it, while let's say the shofar was being blown in the pit and you were in the pit, so you were yotze at that point. So even if you didn't hear the last half properly, but only through an echo, you are yotze. So we have to figure out what this means. That's what it sounds like so far. Mixas kia kodem shiala munashachar, mixas kia lacha shiala munashachar. The time for fulfilling the mitzvah of shofar is only during the daytime, and because it says yom trua yelachem, meaning it has to be during the daytime and not prior to Amud HaShachar. So if part of the blast was heard before Amud HaShachar, you wouldn't have been yosei had you heard the whole blast before Amud HaShachar, but you heard the latter half of the blast after Amud HaShachar. Here the Gemara says lo yasa, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So what's the difference between the first case and the second case? So in either case, it sounds like you only would have been yotze. You only were yotze for half of the blast. Yet in the first case, we say you fulfilled your obligation, and in the second case, we say you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So I'm like, what's the difference between the last case that you needed to hear the entire tekiah after Amud HaShachar, and therefore you're not yotze? So chanami, so to hear in the first case, you have to hear the entire obligation, the entire shofar blast in a fashion in which you would fulfill your obligation, and you haven't. So we say haki hashta. We say no. There's a difference between the two cases because hasam, the second case, when you heard the first half of the shofar blast, it was nighttime. And Laila Lavzon Chiyuvahu, nighttime is not a time of obligation, klal at all. Haka bor makom Chiyuvahu. But here, let's assume that the blast was outside of the pit. So you wouldn't have been yotze in the pit if within the pit you would have heard an echo. But makom chiyuvahu liyosanam din babur. But it is a place of obligation for those people who are inside of the pit and wouldn't hear an echo. So the Mema, the Sava Rabba, or according to the other gersa that we had, I guess it would be Rabba, Shama Sofa to Kia below Techilas Tekia Yatsa, that he would be of the opinion that if you heard the end of the shofar blast without hearing the beginning of the shofar blast properly, because if you were hearing that which was in a pit and you were hearing an echo, you weren't yotze at the beginning, but then when you went outside, you were yotze, that you're yotze. But then it should also follow, umela, techilas tekiah, but it's the same logic. It should also follow that if we're dealing with the same zaman chiyuva or makom chiyuva, and you just heard it in a way that you weren't yotze, but nonetheless, umela techilas tekiah below self tekiah yatsa, you should be yotze, you should fulfill the obligation if you heard the beginning of a tekiah blast properly and not the end of the tekiah blast properly. But tashma, we have we learned previously that this isn't actually true, because we learned the halacha is, we had this just a blot ago on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, that Taka Barishana Mashach B'Shniya B'Shtayim, that if you, let's say, on the first set that you're supposed to hear is Malchios, and the last tekiah at the end of the series of Malchios, so when you were at the beginning of the series, you made a regular tekiah, and then when you got to the end of the series and you had the tekiah acharona, you said it's so long that it should count as the end of the series of Malchios and the beginning of the series of Zichronos, which is supposed to begin with the tekiah. So you don't get credit for 2 tekiyos, you get credit for 1 tekiya, for the tekiya at the end of the series of malchiyos, but you have to blow another tekiya at the beginning of the series of sechonos. But according to this logic, you should bitarti. You really should get credit for both. You get credit because for you split the tekiya into half, and the first half should count to fulfill the obligation of the last tekiya of Malchios, and the second half should count as the tekiya for the beginning of Sikonos, the last half of the tekiya, because you only need half that's going to be kosher. So we say, no, that's not a kasha because we don't break up one blast into two. Okay, we have an answer for that kasha. But what about the following case? Tashma, we also learned, and also the previous good chazara, also the previous blot. If you blow shofar into a pit, or the sochadus, or into one that's above the ground, structurally built, but similar to a pit, like a above ground pool, or the soch hapitas, or you blow it into a large barrel. So in all of these cases, we say in Paul shofar yat shama, if you heard the blow of the shofar, then you would be yotze, you'd fulfill your obligation. But if you only heard an echo, lo yatsa, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So we say b'mai, but according to what Rav is saying now, why should that be? Let him hear at the beginning of the tekiya. Before it goes, the very beginning of the tekiya, the sound hasn't landed, so to speak, inside of the barrel or inside of the pit, and let him be yotze with that first part of the sound. So we say no. We misunderstood why it is. We'll go with Rabbah. Why it is that Rabbah said that you're yotze in the case where you started out inside of the pit and you ended up on top of the pit. It's not that the tekiya was in the same place, and at one point you heard a real sound, and the other point you heard an echo sound. No, Rabba is talking about where the shofar is with you at all times. You blow the shofar at the beginning, you're inside of the pit, and you're walking up the stairs on the side of the pit. And when by the time you finish the blast, then you're on the tip, on the top of the pit, on the border. So the entire time you are hearing the actual shofar sound and not an echo. So it's not a question of hearing only part of it in a fashion that you be yotze. You heard the entire blast in a fashion that you be yotze. Wait a second, but then what is the chiddush? Why do I need Rabbah to teach me that din? Obviously, if you heard the entire blast in a fashion that it was not an echo, but it was a real blast, so of course you were yossi. No, might say Zimnin that I'd have to worry that maybe he's not going to synchronize exactly when his body and when the shofar are going to move from one domain to another. And at one point, maybe his head is that with the ears is going to be in a different domain than the shofar as he's moving from one domain to another domain. So he's going to hear a little bit of an echo noise. Zimnin the mafik reshe vakasi shofar babur, and the shofar is still inside the pit, and his ears are outside of the pit, become Abed Kala, and therefore it's going to mix up the sound, so he's not going to hear purely a kosher sound the entire time. Kamash Malan, that we don't worry so much when we're just dealing with the normal activities of human beings. You move from one domain to the next, we view it as you move the shofar from one domain to the next. We're not going to go crazy.
We're not just talking about the Baltokea. We're talking about anybody who hears the Baltokea.
We're talking about the Baal Tokea, unless unless other people are moving together with the Baal Tokea, then it could be the same din. But the point is that the person's moving from the one domain to the other domain, so he never hears an echo sound from the beginning to the end of the blast. Rabbi Yehuda says that you shouldn't blow with the shofar of a korban ola. This is before Rashi says, Rashi says, before the Zarika, before you have sprinkled the blood on the Mizbeach, because after you sprinkle the blood on the Mizbeach, there's no Me'ila anymore. So we're talking about where it's you took off the korban, you took off the shofar beforehand, you took off the horn of the lamb beforehand in order to blow the shofar. So he says, so it would be a problem in the Elah. So don't do that. Imtaka yotza. But if you did do it, so then you're going to be yotze, because what happens when you violate Me'ilah, which is the misappropriation of sacred objects, in this case a korban, what happens is that it goes to chol. It is taken out of its sanctity. Once it's taken out of its sanctity, so then you can be yotze the mitzvah with it. The shofar shel shlomim lo yitaka. If it's the shofar of shalomim, where there would not be any me'ilah, and we're talking except for the emurim, except for the fats that have to be burned on the mizbeach. And here we're talking, says Rashi, after zrika, after the blood has been sprinkled, there's no me'ilah with respect to the shofar shel shlamim. It's has been shechted. You cut off the ram, you cut off the horn to use, cut off the horn from the ram, and now you're going to blow it as a shofar. B'shofar shel shlamim lo yitaka. Lo yatsa, but because there's no me'ilah, and it's supposed to be used as a korban, but there's no me'ilah per se. You're not yotze. You're not yotze the mitzvah because it's still kachim. My time, and the Gemara is going to explain the reason.
This is actually offered.
No, this is after you offer the korban. There's some still me'ilah in the emurim because the emurim have to be burned on the mizbeach. But it's talking about the actual animal itself. The actual animal itself is not going to be me'ilah. So my time ola bas me'ilah. Ola, there's going to be me'ilah. We're talking about before the zrika, says Rashi, there is me'ilah. And kivat the malba nafkala the chulin. And once you've violated me'ilah by using the horn of the ram for your own personal purposes, so now it's going to be considered chulin, and therefore you fulfill the mitzvah. Shlamim but shlamim is not subjected to me'ilah unless we're dealing with the fats of the shlamim, but the actual body of the shlamim, including the horns of the ram, are not subject to me'ilah. So therefore, isurahu derachi bahu. It's simply an isur that you're not supposed to. It's not a violation of me'ilah per se, but it's a violation of the proper use of kachim, and therefore, lo nafki l'chulin. It's still considered to be in the realm of kachim, and you violated an isser by using it for purposes of a shofar, and therefore you don't fulfill your obligation. So maskip la Rava. So Rava asks, and now of course Tosfos points out that we're talking about when it's done b'shogeg, because b'mezid in the case of the ola wouldn't go to chulin. It only is transferred from kachim to chulin when me'ilah is committed b'shogeg. So maskip la Rava emas mo. So Rava asked the question, wait a second, in the case of the Ola, when did the me'ilah take place? Labasa taka, after he blew the shofar. But when you blew the shofar, it was done be'isr, and it only goes into it only is considered to pass into to become chulin, to be subject to losing its kedusha after me'ilah has been committed. But at the time the me'ilah is being committed, namely when you're blowing the shofar, it still is considered to be kachim. So Elam Rabba echad sev echad zeh lo yatsa. So Rabba says both in the case of when you blow from the horn of the animal that was an ola, and in the case when you blow from the horn of the animal that was a shlamim, you're not yotzei in either case. And then he changed his mind completely, and he said, you know what? You're actually yotzei in both cases. Hadar amma echad sev echad zeh yatsa. You're yotzei in both cases. Why are you yotzei in both cases? Because let's say there's an issur that you're not supposed to get hana from kachim. Who cares? It's not hana when what you're doing is performing a mitzvah. Mitzvahs, lavli hanos nitnu. Mitzvahs are not given for the purpose of enjoyment. Mitzvahs are given for the purpose of performance. So since you're only performing a mitzvah, you're not doing it to get enjoyment. A mitzvah itself is not viewed intrinsically as hana, as Rashi says. Therefore, you're yotzei in either case. Rabbi Yehuda says that you should not blow a shofar that was worshipped as a avodah zarah. It's not nice. Yatsa, but if you were to care, you yotzei because again, mitzvahs ladli hanas nitnu. Shofar shilani dachas lo yitaka. That's a different idea. That's a different idea because there you would have to. You can only really use it as a show if the avodah zarah is nullified. Here we're saying even if the avodah zarah was not nullified, and you can't get hana from it, it's not considered to be hana, so you yotzei the obligation. In case of the shul, you would have to first have a non-Jew nullify the avodah zarah nature of the building. They'd have to knock down, they'd have to break the cross and do some sort of an action, indicating that it's no longer going to be used for idolatry purposes. And it can only be done by a non-Jew as opposed to a Jew. The shofar shall even
should go for the shofar.
Yeah, but the shofar, we're talking about here whether you're yotzei the mitzvah or not. So it still has the status of a shofar shel avodah zarah when you blow it, but you're yotzei the mitzvah because mitzvah slav lehanas ninu. If you ask me whether you should do it, I would say no, Eddie, don't do it. Trust me, I would say to avoid it because it's a davar mius that you're going to fulfill the mitzvah, with a shofar that's worship for avodah zarah, but you would be yotzei. The shofar shiel and idachas lo yitak. But if it's a shofar of a city where the majority of the inhabitants worshipped avodah zarah, where everything in the city has to be burned, including the shofaros that are in the city, then not only should you not blow from the shofar, so you wouldn't fulfill your obligation. Since it has to be burned, it's not considered like it has the requisite shear of a shofar. A shofar has to have a certain measurement that you can hold it, and there would be an amount that protrudes in either direction. Yeah, so they wouldn't have the requisite shear because it's considered as if the shear has been chopped up, it's been burned up because of the fact that there's an obligation of burning everything in an ira nidachas. Along these same lines, Rabbi says that if a person is not allowed to receive hana, there was a neder he took that he's not going to get any benefit from his friend. He said, I'm not going to get any benefit from Eddie. Nonetheless, Eddie can still blow a shofar for him. Because mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu. The same principle is that if you took a neder, you're not going to get any hana, any joy from the shofar. You're still allowed to blow from the shofar for the purposes of fulfilling the mitzvah of shofar because it's not considered to be hana. Along the same lines, there's a neder, you can't get enough from your fellow. That person is allowed to sprinkle upon you the mechatas, to purify you, the waters, mixed with the ashes of the paraduma. If it's during the rainy season, but if it's during the sunny season, where you're also going to get hana from the water because you're sweating and you're going to get like a little bit of a shower, so you're very appreciative for that. You get a little spritz. That you would not be allowed to do because then you're also getting the hana of having a little bit of a spritz of water during a very sunny day. If a person took a neder, he can't get any benefit from a mayan, from a spring. He is allowed to immerse a tefillah mitzvah if there is an obligatory tefillah immersion that he needs to do, but only if it's the rainy season and he doesn't really enjoy the temperature of the water. But if it's the sunny season, he's really going to enjoy the temperature of the water because he's so sweaty. So then he wouldn't be allowed to do it because he's not only doing it for the mitzvah. They asked the father of Shmuel, the following question. They said, what if somebody forced you? They force-fed you matzah. You didn't want to eat matzah. There's some overzealous kiru professionals that come into your house. They say, it's Seder night. You got to have some matzah. And they stuff some matzah down your throat. So have you fulfilled the obligation or not? So the answer is, he said, yeah, yatsa. So kafuman. So who exactly did this? Elaim a kafu shade. Was it a demon that did this? Vatanya. If it was a demon, a person was overtaken by a demon, they have serious psychological issues. So then they weren't Yosei at that point in time because you have to be psychologically normal in order to fulfill the mitzvah. The person is sometimes normal, but he sometimes is just insane. So when he's normal, he's having his normal moments, he took his medicine. So then he's a pikach, and then he's Yotzi the mitzvah. But when he's completely out of whack, he's having his paranoid schizophrenic moments or whatever. Then he's considered to be an imbecile at that point in time, meaning that he is a non-mentally functional person and he does not fulfill the mitzvah. So Amavashi, no, shekafu parsiya parsayim. It was the Persians that did it, okay? So it was people who did it, whatever their incentive was. So Amar Rava Zos Omeris. So Rava says, and again we have a Girsa question here, and the Rosh says Rava Zos Omeris, but we're going to go with Rava. Zos
Does this
Omeris.
speak also to the mitzvah that you have to eat matzah behaseba?
Yeah, they talk about this. How could a person be yotze if he didn't do it behaseba? So they say, well, they force you to do it behaseba as well. So Amar Rava Zos Omeris, but there is a discussion there. It's a very good question. So Amar Rava Zos Omeris Atokea L'Shir Yatza. So Rava says that this teaches us that you don't need kavana. You don't need kavana. That if you blew the shofar just because you wanted to play a ditty, you wanted to play a little song, and it came out, the notes came out like tekiya, shvarim, trua, tekiya, and so forth. So since we see from the case of the parsaim stuffing the matzah down your throat that you could be yotze in this case as well. Yotze pshita, I know. We say obviously that's a clear equation between the two cases. So say no. The chiddush of Rav is matzah hasam matzah. In the first case, the Torah says eat matzah, and he ate matzah. So I understand that he was yotze. But in the second case, on the topical class and basic, on Truaksiv, it says that you have to have a memory, a thought process that you're doing in Trua. And there's no thought process, so Kamash Malan, that we're going to equate the two cases. The Rambam says in the case of the matzah, you're yotze, but if somebody's tokeh just his slamed, he's misasek, and he's just blowing the shofar because he wants to learn how to blow the shofar or teach somebody else. So then he's not yotze. So Shulchan Aruch assumes, he's codifying the halacha based on the Rambam, that according to the Rambam, if you blew the shofar, the shir, just to sing a ditty, and it came out like a tkiya, trua, tkiya, that you would not be yotze, which seems to go against Rava's equations. So some say eating is different because mitzvah slav lehanos nitnu, or because it's result oriented. But when the mitzvah is also a thought process, like in the case of the shofar, we really do draw a distinction. Others say it's a typo. The Maggid Mishnah suggests a typo in the Rambam, and that he holds this mitzvah strichos kavan, and therefore even in the case where somebody fed you matzah, you also would not be a yotze. Others say that fundamentally the Rambam holds in both cases that you would be yotze even in the case where you blew the shofar for the purpose of singing a song. But Asher Weiss says Rambam never said you're not yotze. Rambam only said you're not yotze when you blow the shofar in order to learn how to blow the shofar, because then you're doing a separate mitzvah, chinuch, so you can't be yotze a different mitzvah when you're doing the first mitzvah. Okay, I think I covered the territory. Alma kasava Rava, mitzvahs ain't strikos kavana. So it sounds like Rava says that mitzvahs don't require kavana. So Esvei, so we have a kasha. Hayakari b'Torah. If you're reading the Torah, begins man and mikra, and now it's time to be yotzei's kriya shema. And kiben liba yasu navlo yatsa. You only fulfill kriya shema if you had in mind to fulfill kriya shema, but otherwise not. So it sounds like mitzvah strichos kavana. My love kiben liba lot says. Does it not mean that you have to have kavana in order to fulfill the mitzvah? So say no. You don't need to fulfill kavana to fulfill the mitzvah. You just have to have kavana. You're doing the action you're doing. The likros. You have to have kavana that you're reading. Likros, what do you mean? He had kavana that he's reading. We said the person is kari b'Torah, hakakari. To say no, but kari lagia. Rashi says he wasn't really reading, properly. He was just kind of slurring the words. So you have to, make sure to say it properly. Okay. Or some say that it's not really a reading. He was just kind of looking at it in order to write a Sefer Torah. So that's not considered to be like a kriya per se.
He was reading Parshas Veschanan.
He was reading, Parshas Veschanan, obviously, right?
What about with the stolen shofar?
What about with the stolen shofar? So that's the question of a mitzvah haba ba'avera, right? That if you steal it,
Not the listener.
Right. Right. I think we would say there too. I think so. I think we would say mitzvah slav lehanos nitnu. We're talking about with respect to the shofar, So Tashma haya over achore base, because remember that's a different question. Right now we're talking about kavana. You have kavana to be yotze, be yotze. In terms of whether there's a violation, so we already said that regardless of the status of the shofar, we say mitzvah slav lehanos nitnu. So Tashma haya over achore beis hakneses, so shaya beis samach beis hakneses. If a person was passing the back of a shul, or his house happened to be near the shul. In my previous house where I used to live in Riverdale, so we were right across the shul. You could actually hear it. If they blew the shofar, you'd be able to hear it, sitting in our living room. if they blew it loud enough. V'shama kol shofar kol Megillah. If you heard the shofar, you heard the Megillah. And kivein libo yatsa. If you had a mind to be yotze, then it works. Then you fulfill the obligation. Lav lo yatsa. If you didn't have in mind to fulfill the obligation, then you're not yotze. My 11 kivein libo yatsa. So does this not mean that you need to have kavanah to fulfill the obligation? Mitzvah srikas kavanah against Rava. So say lo lishmoa. It means that you just have to have a mind to hear it. You have to have a mind to be doing the physical action, and that's because otherwise it's misasik b'yama. So lishmoa behashama. What are you talking about? But a person can't help but hearing what he hears. No, he has to understand that he's hearing a shofar. In this case, if he doesn't pay attention, he might just think it's the braying of a donkey. Okay. Another kasha. If the shomea, the person who heard the shofar, had in mind to be yotze, but the person blowing the shofar didn't have in mind to be motzi, or the other way around, mashmiya v'lo niskaven shomea. Lo yatsa, then a person is not fulfill the obligation, and she's kaven shomea umashmiya. So the person who heard it, the person who's blowing the shofar, both have in mind to be motzi each other. So bishlam and niskaven mashmiya v'lo niskaven shomea. So I understand, based on what we just said, the person who hears it, he has to have in mind, doesn't necessarily mean that he has to have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah. He has to have in mind that he's hearing a shofar. Otherwise, he might think it's the praying of a donkey. Ella, but the case where we require the person blowing the shofar to have in mind, he knows he's blowing the shofar. Are we not talking about where if you blew the shofar in order to play a ditty of some sort, and we're saying that's not good enough, so that goes against Rava. So we say no. The dilma, the kaminabeach nebuche. Maybe what we're talking about is where he's just a kind of blowing like a tiny little sounds into the shofar. Where they are very short notes that would not be sufficient in order to fulfill the obligation. It's not the requisite measurement of how long a tekiah trua needs to be. But if the person really had in mind to blow the shofar and blew the requisite measurement, so then that would be good enough in order to exempt somebody else. Others say maybe this case, we could say is a little bit, different, not the answer the Gemara gives. But maybe when you're being motzi somebody else, that's a different standard, where I need a connection created between the blower and the person who hears it. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye is going to ask on this. Abaye says, Elamiata, Hayashem V'Shmini B'Sukkah, if a person sleeps on the 8th day of Shmini of Sukkot, namely Shmini Atzeres in the Sukkah, we're talking about an Eretz Yisrael, well, clearly it's not Sukkot anymore, so that would be Baal Tosif, Yilakeh. He should get malchus even if he doesn't have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah, because mitzvahs ain't shrikos kabana. And even if he just sleeps there because it's a nice day, he should get malchus about tosif. So I'm alone. So the answer given could be given by Rava is Shani Omer. No, that it's not going to be a violation of Baal Tosif because mitzvahs ain't over land ela bismanim. Baal Tosif is only violated if it's at the time of the fulfillment of the mitzvah. Like you put a 5th parsha in the tefillin, or you put a 5th fringe, on your tzitzis, so that's Baal Tosif. But if it's past the time of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, you wouldn't violate Baal Tosif. So it's not a problem that the person didn't have. That will say that even though the person didn't have kavanah, it would be considered as if they did have kavanah and they'd be over Baal Tosif.
Sleeping and
How do we know that a Kohen who dukin shlo yomar will have a nationally Torah v'shis levarkas hiso osif v'achas mishali? While we're on the subject about Tosif, how do we know a Kohen shouldn't add? There were 3 brachas yorechka, right? And Yisan Yair. So how do we know that a Kohen should not add another bracha? How do we know he shouldn't add another bracha? Tamid lama lo sosifu ala davar, that you're not supposed to. Because it says lo sosifu ala davar, that you're not supposed to add the mitzvah at all. So here he's adding to the mitzvah. It's about violation about Tosif. Why don't we say that since he finished the three brachos, right? He said, you saw he finished the three brachos, so now this man of Birkas Kohanim is over. He shouldn't be, according to this logic, he shouldn't be over about Tosif. Tani Dava. So how come my skin blow see him? We say no. We're talking about where he didn't finish the three brachos. He added another brach in the middle of the three. By the time you see him, but the Bryce actually says he finished. So we say see him bracha akas. No, he finished. Means he finished, let's say, the first bracha, but not all three. By the time you see him, but we have a Brisa, somebody's writing this as the Brisa in front of him, saying what the Brisa says that he finished all the brachas. So we say, Shiny Akak, even the Ilumitami, like Sibur Akavina, it's not like Shmini Atzeres, Kusukis is just gone and over and finished with. Here, over the course of the day, the Kohen duchen once, but if another opportunity would come along, like the minion next door, like the downstairs minion says, we don't have a Kohen, come and please duchen with us for us. So he would duchen again. So the time of duchening really continues the entire day. Minat Timur, the Rav Soloveitchik held that because of this din, that the Kohen can't add a bracha when he finishes the duchening and he comes down from the duchen, and people say Yeshikayak, he's not allowed to say Baruch Tiyeh, which is, a little bit of a hard halakha to keep because it's sort of like insulting to people. They come over and say Shikayak, but I don't say Baruch Tiyeh after I duchen. I just kind of like nod and, because to keep it so lucky. Because it's Baltosi, you're adding a bracha. Baruch Tiyeh, you're adding a bracha. So I asked for Shepler once. I said, isn't it, kind of rude? Maybe I should, be allowed to say it just not to be rude. So, he just kind of like shrugged, which meant that no. Okay, not Timra.
What about this answer the Gemara? The next opinion over.
Exactly. So it's still a problem about Tosif. That's why you can't say Baruch Tiyeh, right? Not Timra. So how do we know this? This whole idea of the Baal Tosif. The Tanan, the Mishnah says, you have some blood of a korban bechor that only gets one sprinkling, gets mixed up with the blood of another korban bechor, a korban ma'aseh behema, which only requires one sprinkling. No problem. You take the mixture of blood and you sprinkle it once. You get a little bit of, both the blood, both sets of blood get mixed together, and they both get sprinkled one time on the mizbeach. Matan dal. You have a korban like a chatas, it's supposed to have 4 sprinklings. It gets mixed up with another korban chatas that gets 4 sprinklings. Fine, you take from the combination mixture of blood and you sprinkle 4 times. Not a matan dalad. However, what happens if a chatas gets mixed up with the blood of a chatas gets mixed up with the blood of a bechor? Matan dalad, matan achas. Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, Samachlokes, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Eliezer, Omer. Rabbi Eliezer says, you're not in matan dalad. You should make 4 sprinklings. Better to have too many than too little. Rabbi Yeshua, who we hold like, you're not in matan achas. Better you should only have 1 sprinkling, not 4 sprinklings, because you have 4 sprinklings of the korban bechor. It's going to be about tosif. So I'm Rabbi Eliezer over about. So Rabbi Eliezer says, but you're still going to be over about tigara. It's still a violation of below sigra'u that you have sprinkled too little with respect to the korban chatas. So I'm Rabbi Yeshua over about tosif. But according to you, you sprinkle 4 times. Whether you're going to be over about tosif with respect to the blood of the bechor. So Amalei Rabbi Eliezer don't have about Tosif, Ela b'shu'u be'atzmo. So Rabbi Eliezer says it's only about Tosif when it's by itself, but now that it's also mixed with the korban chatas, it's not about Tosif. So Amalei Rabbi Yeshua, great. By the same logic, lo nema about tigara ela b'shu'u be'atzmo. It's not that it's only a violation of about tigara when it's by itself. But in this case, since you also have the korban bechor that only gets 1 sprinkling, it's not going to be a violation of Baal Tigara with respect to the korban chatas. And not only that, but I have another consideration, says Rabbi Yeshua, as to why my position is better than yours. Because the other Rabbi Yeshua, Kishalon Asata, about Tigara, let's say you didn't have all 4 sprinklings, so it'll be a violation according to the logic of Rabbi Eliezer of Baal Tigara, but you weren't Yotze Bekum Ve'aseh. You sprinkled 1 time legitimately because you needed it for the korban of bechor. But in terms of not having enough sprinklings of the korban chata, so that was only violated by not sprinkling through a sheve al taseh. But if you're going to sprinkle 4 times, which is going to be too much for the korban bechor, not only have you violated Baal Tosif arguably, but you've done it bekum ve'aseh. So in this case,
aren't you don't say just once you do 1 sprinkling though?
It depends with what. With the let's say it's well, I guess you're right. If it's the sprinkling of a kratas pnimios, so then you're not yotze. Then they're all miyake. But otherwise, you're yotze. But you'll be doing it. You know, you don't want to do things for the ever. You want to do things l'chatchila. You're right. You would be yotze. In fact, that's why he says only sprinkle it once, because you are yotze. You haven't done the mitzvah kidua. You haven't done it in the best possible fashion, but but you still yotze. Yeah. Okay.
Because if the blood
But nonetheless, but even if you're
If-
yosei,
if-
it's still
if you got
it's still
blood
about
sprinkled
tigara. If
in.
it's spills, so you haven't violated anything. But here it's a violation because you have the capability of sprinkling 4 times, and you haven't sprinkled all 4 times. So therefore, it would still be a violation about tigara. Like you could be yotze with the evidence, but you still violated about tigara by not sprinkling as many as you're supposed to sprinkle. It's a good question. Okay, so the hahacha kimin the ayivle matana, but in this particular case, once you have sprinkled the one time mi bechor, the one sprinkling of the korban bechor, so then you have it's already no longer matana achas mi bechor avale lizmane. It's no longer this man of sprinkling the bechor, and yet nonetheless, Rabbi Yeshua is saying to Rabbi Eliezer, that when you sprinkle the additional 3 times and there's still blood of the Bechor included within, you violate Baal Tosif. So this would seem to also indicate, this is the proof for the position that we just stated, that since that it's still considered to be the Zman, unlike the case of Shmini Atzeres, because if the person would have another korban before, the Kohen would have another korban before offered that day, so he would sprinkle again. So we say, in my Dilma, you could argue the following: Dilma Kasav Rabbi Yeshua mitzvahs over and afilu shlo bismanon. No, maybe Rabbi Yeshua is of the opinion that you could violate a mitzvah even shlo bismanon. It's not, necessarily the case that he goes along with this principle that we stated with respect to Shmini Atzeres. So Ananaki Kamina, we say no. What we're saying is as follows. So Shman Bar Abba is the one who gave the case of the Kohen not being allowed to add an extra bracha. Shman Bar Abba, my time of Shavik Masnisen Umosiv Mibraisa. Why did Shaman Bar Abba ask the kasha from the case of the Kohen She'ol L'Duchen, where he said, "Oh, we see that he still violates, Tosif, even though he fulfilled the mitzvah. Why didn't he ask from this Mishnah? He could have asked from this Mishnah with respect to the Bechor. Rabbi Eliezer said, where Rabbi Yeshua said that if you sprinkle another 3 times, you're going to violate Baal Tosif. Masisa my time in the Mosif, Kivan the low. So obviously the reason he didn't ask the kasha was the Kivan the Ilu Misami Le Bechor Acharina, that it's understood that you haven't passed the time of sprinkling the dam of the Bechor, because the Kohen could always bring another Bechor the same day. So therefore, this is where we are showing from this Mishnah that this is a good answer to the kasha that he brought from the case of the Kohen, that also is still considered to be within the same Zman. Since if the Kohen would find another tzibor, he would make a birchas kohanim again. So the entire day is considered this man. Rashman Barabba Hasam Lo saying the reason why Rashman Barabba thought it was a bigger kasha from the Brisa regarding the Kohen than he did from the Mishnah regarding the sprinkling of the mixed up blood. Rashman Barabba Hasam Lo Sagi Lo Yai. The Kohen, if he has a korban to bring, so he's obligated to sprinkle the blood. But a Kohen who has another minion where he can duchen at, so he has the option of not duchening at that minion. So therefore, he thought that this was a bigger kasha. So Rava Amar Latseis Labai Kavana Lava Bai Kavana. So Rava says that to fulfill the mitzvah does not require kavana. That's why he says that you force fed the matzah or you blow the shofar for purposes of just playing a song. You're yotze the mitzvah, no problem. But in order to violate a mitzvah, like on Shmini, sleeping in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, to violate Baal Tosif, to violate an avera, that requires kavana. That's an answer he gives. Matan Damim Rabbi Yeshua. But according to Rabbi Yeshua, if you sprinkle too many sprinklings of the mixed up blood, so you've sprinkled the Bechor blood 4 times, then you're over, even though you didn't have kavanah to sprinkle the Bechor blood, you only had kavanah to sprinkle the Chadis blood. So let's have a different formulation. Rava says, to fulfill the mitzvah, you don't need kavanah. To violate a transgression, if it's during the Zaman, that it would be normally transgressed. So then you don't require kavanah. Like if you put a fifth parsha in your tefillin, it doesn't require kavanah. But shalom is mano by kavanah. But if it's not in the Zaman, namely you're sleeping in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, so then you're only going to, or for that matter, 2 weeks later, you're only going to violate the Avera Baal Tosef if you had in mind to fulfill the mitzvah. Amalei Rabbi Zeir l'Shmaya. Rabbi Zeir said to his attendant, okay, we have about 15 minutes to finish this block. He said, have in mind to blow the shofar for mitzvah fulfillment and blow for me. Sounds like the person who blows the shofar really does have to have kavanah to be mostly somebody else. So we asked the kasha of the case of person who's passing from behind the shul or his house is next to the shofar, and he hears the sound of the shofar, Kol Megillah, or the sound of the Megillah, and keeping liba lo yasim, b'chalab lo yatsa. He cares that if he has kavanah, he's yotzi, not, and if not, not. But why then, if you need the mashmiya, the person who's blowing the shofar to have kavanah, so the person who's reading on the Megillah or blowing the shofar, here he has to have kavanah. To keep in liba, my habe. What good is it if the person who hears it has kavanah? The person who's blowing the shofar doesn't have in mind the person who lives next door. So we say, no, he's a shliach tzibur. A shliach tzibur always has everybody in mind. That's why he's called shliach tzibur. Shliach tzibur asking, he has everybody in mind who might hear him. In fact, a good shliach tzibur wants the whole world to hear him. They should hear his beautiful voice. Tashma niskaven shameh v'lo niskaven mashmiya. So we learn as well, if the person who hears has in mind, not the person who blows, niskaven mashmiya v'lo niskaven shameh, the other way around. Lo yatsa ad sheyiskaven shameh umashmiya. That you're not yotze until both the shameh and the mashmiya have in mind to be motzi and to be yotze. Ketani mashmiya dumya de shameh. So it sounds like the mashmiya is similar to the shameh. Mashmiya shameh le'atzmo, af mashmiya le'atzmo uketani. And it says lo yatsa. That here as well, it sounds like you need the that the mashmiya in this particular case had in mind to be mashmiya la'atzmo only for himself. Uketani lo yatsa, and the assumption is that you wouldn't fulfill the obligation, namely that the mashmiya, if he does not have in mind anybody else, that specifically and explicitly, that they wouldn't be yotze. So how can you say that there's an automatic intention to be motzi? Everybody should say tonight, it's my focus tonight. The Tanya Brisa says, Shemea le'atzmo, mashmiya lefi darko. That the person who hears, has in mind to be yotze, and the person who blows has in mind lefi darko, that like only for just whatever his normal kavanah is, and that's going to be good enough. We see that even if he just is lefi darko, it's imputed that since he's a shliach tzibur, he has everybody in mind. So I'm Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi says that yes, that this is only true of a shliach tzibur, meaning that according to Rabbi Yossi, this is a shliach tzibur does not need to have everybody in mind. But if you're dealing with a yachid who blows, then if the yachid doesn't specifically have in mind the listener, then the listener is not going to be yotze. But yachid lo yatsa sheyiskaven shamea umashmiya. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, the case of mashmiya not being motzi everybody unless he specifically has that person in mind is in fact the halacha when you're not dealing with a shliach tzibur. It's only a shliach tzibur that we assume has everybody in mind, but if it's a yachid, then they have to specifically have in mind the person who's walking next to their house when they blow the shofar, that they would want that person to be yotze. Okay, so Naya Mishnah, that it says that during Mechemes Amalek, that when Moshe raised his hands, that's when the Jewish people were victorious. So dependent on Moshe to make or break the war, his hands, no, it means that everybody has to have in mind, when they saw the hands of Moshe raised up, they had to have in mind the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and that's when they were victorious. Similar with respect to the Nakash and Choshes. Asay l'cha saraf, Hashem said, make like the image of a snake, copper image of a snake. Anyone who's bitten looks at it and lives. It's a magic potion. It's a copper snake that causes a person to live or die. Rather, when people look towards the Kodesh Baruch Hu, then they were healed. And otherwise, they were to get sicker. A deaf mute or an imbecile or a katan cannot. They're not obligated in the mitzvah, and therefore they can't be most of the other people when they blow the shofar. You're not obligated yourself. You can be most of the others. Tana Rabbanan. Brisa says, everybody's obligated to shofar. Freed slaves and gave them. Androgynous person, we don't know what sex they are. Person who has both sexes. You have the half freed, half slave. And tumtum, so all of those people are obligated. However, tumtum cannot fulfill, cannot be mostly somebody who is a fellow tumtum or anybody else, because maybe he's in a keva, and maybe the other tumtum is a zachar. Androgynous mostly is mino baloa she'enu mino, and androgynous is considered to be a combination of male and female, so he can be mostly another androgynous. Another androgynous is exactly the same, but not somebody who's not an androgynous, because he has a female portion to him. Person who's a half slave, half freed person can't be motzi anybody because he's a half slave, and he can't, even the half slave of him can't be motzi the half freed man in him. Everybody's obligated, including Kohanim Leviim. Big deal, Pshita, obviously. Jews are obligated. They're not obligated. Who's obligated? The angels? Kohanim and Tzrika say, no, I need the Kohanim case. Says Yom Kohanim are obligated in show for the entire year. So I might think that it's not just Yom, it's not just this day, maybe they're not obligated. You have to blow the shofar when they bring a korban. So I think they're not obligated. They're obligated. Me tell me. What do you mean? There, when they blow on the korban, it's trumpets. It's not a shofar, but a shofar. No, we need for a different reason. It's like from that Rosh Hashanah is similar to Yovel in terms of the tzkiyos that you make and the brachos that you make. Mandisa mitzvahs Yovel, mitzvahs Rosh Hashanah. I might think that whoever if it has to fulfill Yovel has to fulfill the tzkiyah of Rosh Hashanah. How many Kohanim? Well, the mitzvahs the Yovel. The Kohanim don't have to fulfill all the mitzvahs of Yovel. The Tanakh Kohanim will be Malchim the Olam. They could sell their stay achuzah even if it's like 2 years before the Yovel. They go on the item and they can redeem it forever, and they can redeem a stay achuzah that they were makish that they sold. They could, buy it back. If they were makish a stay achuzah that they can redeem it forever. So mitzvah to Rosh Hashanah. So I might think that they wouldn't be obligated in the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah. Kamash Malan, they're obligated in other aspects of Yovel, like sending back their of them and stuff like that. So Misha Chetzio Eved Chetzio Ben Korim in a motzi lo esmino lo sheinu. So if a person's half slave, half free man, then he can't be motzi anybody. I'm Avuna la'atzma motzi. Avuna says he can be motzi himself. So I'm like Avuna ma'isham lachem lo asi atzaravis matzikiroi can't be motzi other people because he's a half slave, so he can't be motzi the free part of other people. So he shouldn't be able to be motzi himself because the half slave part of him can't be motzi the half free man part of him. But Menachem therefore says he can't be motzi even himself. Tanya Nam Yaakov Bryce also says which Chetzi have the Chetzi Ben Kohen after that's when the motzi can be motzi even himself. Tanya Yaakov Rabbi Rabbi Zerah Kol Bakas Kol Nafri Shetzi Motzi. All the Bakas, even though you fulfill your obligation, can be motzi somebody else because Kol Yisrael Ravim Zebazeh. Of course, we bekas lechem bekas yain, except for things that you're only eating for enjoyment, like bread and wine. Shim liyatza motzi, from yatza ain't a motzi. That if you're eating the bread or drinking the wine yourself, you can be motzi others, but otherwise you can't. So by Rava, says, if it's the bekas lechem that you make a matzah, it's the bekas yain they make on kiddush. Mahu, what about in that case? Because there is a bekas and nenin component to it, but there's also mekaylesh Shabbos and sheker shem to start with sivana achilas matzah, which is the mitzvah element. So given the chovu mapik, since it's also a chova element, maybe the nenin also you come to fulfill the obligation even though you're not eating it yourself, drinking the wine yourself. Or maybe a bracha, the bracha on the bechas and nenin itself is not the obligatory part. So it's not the mitzvah itself. So Tashma the Ravashi giving me a puppy, or the Makai Sonaki of that of a puppy, when he would make a kiddush when I would be in his house and he would drink the coffee, he arise midabra, and when his aris would come late on Friday night and we need kiddush himself, on Makai Shlu, he would make kiddush again, even though he wouldn't be drinking the wine this time. So therefore, we see that it works if it's a wine of Kiddush. So you could, even though you were Yotzi the mitzvah yourself previously. A person should not give bread to a guest unless he's going to eat with the guest when he's making a motzi. But he is allowed to make the birchas hamotzi for his children in order to teach them how to make the bracha properly, even though he already ate. When it comes to Hal Megillah, where there is no hana that is involved, so then we say for sure that even though you already fulfilled the mitzvah, you can make the bracha again for other people in order to be motzi them. If I have Yom Tov or Rosh Hashanah that falls down on Shabbos, Mikdash token. They would only break below the shelf in the base of Mikdash, below in Medina, but not outside the base of Mikdash, not in the Medina, even in Yerushalayim. The Rambam says Yerushalayim had the same din as the base of Mikdash, and they would blow the shofar throughout Yerushalayim according to the Rambam. Yishachar base of Mikdash, when the base of Mikdash was destroyed, Hitzki Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, she told them Chamakim Sheish Bezin. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made a tukana. They should blow the shofar in any place that has the bezin. Rabbi Elazar, some say Rashi, it sounds like only a place that had a bezin of 23. From the Rif says that even a bezin of 3. The Rif actually blew the shofar on Shabbos. That fell out of Rosh Hashanah fell out on Shabbos in front of his bezin of 3, but we don't generally follow the approach of the Rif. I'm Rabbi Elazar. We don't follow that opinion. I'm Rabbi Elazar. Lohiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai B'Yavne Bavad. That Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai only made the takana in Yavne, which was like the big place where the base of Mikdash built it, moved it, where the Sanhedrin moved. After the base of Mikdash was destroyed. Amalo, they said to him, no. That it was every single place Yesh Bezdin where there was a big Bezdin. Lozos, I say Yerushalayim, you say about Yavne. Yerushalayim, what do you mean? Yerushalayim was also greater than Yavne. We didn't say how it was greater than Yavne. According to Rambam, it was greater because they always blew in Yerushalayim, even during the time of the base of Mikdash. But the Odzos, the Gemara will explain why it says the Odzos. I say Yerushalayim, you say Yavne. Token that in Yerushalayim, when they would blow in Yerushalayim, to assume after the base of Mikdash was destroyed, it was a Bez in Yerushalayim. So any city that was nearby and would hear and and they would be able to see from that place, and there wasn't a river that separated them, so they would actually physically be able to come. Token, they would blow on Rosh Hashanah that fell on Shabbos. But when they blew the shofar in Yavne, though you're talking about the Bezdin Mavad, they only blew in the place of the Bezdin itself. Gemara says, how do we know that the shofar would be blown even on Shabbos in the base of Mikdash, but not outside of the base of Mikdash? One of Pasuk says Shabbason Zikron Trua. That Shabbason it's a day of remembrance of shofar. So it's a day of blowing the shofar. So Lokasha, so we can reconcile the two psukim. Is it remembrance or an actual blowing? Shabbos depends. If it falls on Shabbos, so then it's a remembrance outside of the base of Mikdash. But otherwise, you blow the shofar all over when it falls out on a weekday. If it's midaraisa, the Mikdash ain't takinan, then how would we allow you to blow the shofar in the base of Mikdash? You're not allowed to blow the shofar on Shabbos because it's only a zikron trua. And also, the truth of the matter is that on a deraisa level, you should be able to blow the shofar because it's not a real malaka. This is called the muted. The Tana, the Beis Shmuel, you're not allowed to do a malaka of a voda of yont. So Yatzat's Kia Shofar Sapashi Chachma, as opposed to a Kia Shofar, blowing the shofar or scraping the bread from the walls of the oven, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos but only because it's a Chachma. But only Durabanan, because on a Deraisa level, it's only a Chachma, Ve'ena Malachas. Even on Shabbos, technically speaking, you will be allowed to blow the shofar. Sosa says. Rather, Rabbi says even on Shabbos, Midaraisa, you're allowed to blow the shofar. But in the Gazaba, but Chachamim made a gezerah not to blow the shofar when the Rosh Hashanah falls on a Shabbos based on the din of Rabbah. What's the din of Rabbah? Everybody's obligated to shofar. Not everybody is eligible. How to do it? Zera. So therefore, a person might want to blow the shofar, and they're going to walk in the Rishus Rabbim for Amos in order to go to an expert who lives, a little bit further down in town to ask him how to blow the shofar. He's going to work for hours with Shishram. The shofar is just sitting there. He's going to maybe carry it. If he starts in his own house, Tosa says he's not going to forget himself and go outdoors. But if it's just sitting on the street, on the road, he might walk 4 hours with him. I know time in the Lulav, I know time in the Megillah. That's the reason why we don't check the Lulav on Shabbos. And that's the reason why we don't lay in the Megillah on Shabbos. We just do it very quickly. It was one time when Shoshana fell out on Shabbos, you call Arim, Wisconsin, and all of the cities or all the people came in, they wanted to hear the shofar. So they all came to Yavne. So Yochanan and Zakkai said to the B'nai Seir, they were like in charge, they were the Gedolei Ador, Niska. So he said, let's blow the shofar. Amalol, he said to Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, Nidon, let's first decide whether it's an appropriate thing to do on Shabbos. So Lam, Nizka V'chaka Nidon. So let's first blow the shofar, then figure out if it was the right thing for us to do. After they blew the shofar, Amalol, Nidon. So he said, okay, let's figure out what's the right thing to do. Amalol, too late. Vanisma, Karen Miyavna. Play in words, not Karen Miyavna, but Karen Miyavna. The horn was already blown in Yavna, so now it's too late to even deliberate. And after you're ready, Paskin, you don't worry about it anymore. Stop here.